Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to re-look at a 1975 album from George Harrison, which I haven't talked about for a few years. It's this album from George from September 75 called Extra Texture. Just before I get into that, I just want to mention quickly, been a couple of quotes I've seen recently attributed to John Lennon, one of which I saw on a t-shirt in Brighton, and the quote was, "It's weird not to be weird." John Lennon, and a picture of John Lennon. And a friend of mine who I was with at the time was very impressed and said, "That's a good quote." I said, "Well, it's not actually by John." And we looked it up and can't find any record of it being by John. And then the other day, yesterday, I had lunch with a friend and he was raving about this other quote from John saying, "Everything will be okay in the end, and if it's not okay, it's not the end." Well, for starters, that's just pretentious bullshit, in my opinion, and it's not even worthy of any religious leader or any pop star, really, let alone John Lennon. And can find no record. If any of you out there think that it was said by John Lennon, then please let me know. But I find it quite annoying that the internet just attributes quotes to people without having the source documented. Anyway, that's just a minor grumble. Anyway, this George Harrison record started off for me when I found this copy in a bargain bin in H.G. Moore, which was a shop in Wimbledon High Street, which was an electronic shop which sort of dabbled in records as well. And I picked it up for £1, £1, and delighted, obviously, to only pay £1, but kind of did sort of make me think it wasn't that good a record. And I suppose I spent the first few years thinking it's okay, but nothing special. And then just in recent years, just been reappraising it. And a lot of other people have been reappraising it. And there is more to this album than some of the critics make out, although it's quite fun to read the contemporary reviews of it. But anyway, so before I discuss the album, I'll just show you my other copies. So this is my son Richie's copy, a lovely copy, a US copy with the cutout, which was missing from my other copy. And if you do pick up a copy of this cutout sleeve, just make sure it's intact, because the letters can get torn quite easily. For example, on my Japanese copy, which does have the Obi strip here, but as you can see, one of the letters is come unstuck, or torn, should I say. So that's a bit annoying. But this Japanese copy is very nice because it contains the lyrics, albeit amusingly translated into English from someone who didn't speak very good English, I think. But anyway, it's nice to have the Japanese copy. And this was a German copy. You can see all these covers are slightly different. For example, this copy I first picked up, the Hare Krishna sign here is not in blue, but on the Japanese copy it is in blue, and also on the US copy it's in blue, and on the German copy from the early 80s, it's not even there at all. They've just got rid of it. And as you can see, the cutout sleeve was the original, if you were lucky enough to pick up that. And then this was the sort of reissue with have a nice textured kind of sleeve here. So it's not completely cheaply done. But this German copy, the actual cover is just, there's no texture at all. It's just orange and blue print. But the good thing about this German pressing is it's on the Apple label. So that was why I picked it up, purchased it on Discogs, got it shipped to Hungary, and I was delighted to have that. So that's my various copies of Extra Texture, and then I picked up 2 copies on the CD. This was the original, which came out with no bonus tracks. I remember it was absolutely full price at the time, in early 90s, at the time when a lot of the Wings and McCartney albums were selling for a lot less than full price. Now this was a more recent and more pleasing reissue, because they've taken more care with the packaging, with the gatefold sleeve, and they've replicated the inner sleeve, and they've even replicated the sleeve on the CD. And also there's a great bonus track of this guitar, Can't Keep From Crying, recorded in 1992 with Dave Stewart on guitar and Ringo Starr on drums, among others. So that's a very, very interesting version. So back to the album. September 75, got to number 8 in the US and number 16 in the UK, which is not great, but Dark Horse, although it had got to number 4 in the US, didn't even chart in the UK, so this was a slight improvement for George, to say the least, in England. One can say it's fairly keyboard dominated, unlike more so than any other George album I can think of. David Foster's playing many of the keyboards on this album, but Gary Wright's also features. Leon Russell is on a couple of tracks. And one has to say, there's limited guitar playing from George, which is a shame because it is his strength at the end of the day. And if you compare an album like this to, say, Cloud 9, his big comeback in '87, which had a lot of, I think Jeff Lynne made sure that there was a lot of slide guitar playing on that album, and it vastly benefited that particular album, whereas here, the guitar break through very occasionally, and it's almost as if he'd lost confidence in his guitar playing, or maybe he didn't think the songs warranted any kind of extravagant playing. But anyway, I would say the production is slightly on the muddy side. It's self-produced by George Harrison, I think. Don't think there's a co-credit for anyone else producing. It was recorded, it's the only George album recorded in the USA, it's interesting, in Los Angeles, and Jim Keltner is on record saying he doesn't think that George should have ventured outside of the UK or outside of Friar Park to record an album. There were too many distractions in Los Angeles. He was living in a hotel. He was surrounded by all kinds of people with various bad things on offer for him to get involved in, such as drugs, I presume he was referring to. And it probably is reflected on this record. He seems to be a bit lackluster and not really high on confidence, and more in the doldrums. And this was coming on just a few months off the back of his disappointing tour. When I say disappointing in terms of how it was received by the critics and a few of the fans. So I think he was like kind of knocked for six by the criticism there, particularly from Rolling Stone magazine, which featured this big article at the time of the tour called Lumbering in the Material World, which was pretty harsh. Anyway, back to the album. One can say on the positive side, it's a very soulful album, and you won't hear George exploring soul music quite like this on any other of his solo albums. So in that sense, it's quite refreshing, and it's less commercial, with the exception of the hit single You. It's less commercial than a lot of his later efforts, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on one's mood. If you want to be uplifted by a whole series of love songs, then play catchy love songs and play self-titled George Harrison. If you want to if you don't mind listening to an album of depressing material but with interesting lyrics and interesting arrangements, then check this one out. It's not as bad as some people make out, although the themes are quite depressing. I mean, if you look at the track listing, World of Stone, including lyrics like I'm so far from home, Grey Cloudy Lies includes the lyric I only want to be with no pistol at my brain, but sometimes it gets so lonely, no hope in sight, that kind of thing. Pretty depressing, but mixed with a couple of uplifting tunes, such as he's just met his future wife Olivia Arias, and he was going out with her. So there's a few songs reflecting that sort of blossoming relationship, like Can't Stop Thinking About You is a very soulful ballad, although the lyrics obviously are very repetitive and it does go on too long, but it's quite nice. You is a very nice love song, although it was written in '71 for Ronnie Spector and never, I think Ronnie Spector recorded a guide vocal but never got further than that, and it's a shame because I would like to hear her version of it. As George said in an interview, it's in a very high register, so it's a bit too high for him to sing, but he has a creditable effort. And the arrangement is great, and it's a mixture of the 71 session with Jim Gordon on drums, Carl Ruddle on bass, and Gary Wright on keyboards, I think. And then I'm not sure when Leon Russell typed his part, and Jim Keltner did a second drum part at and did it at a slightly different half speed, so to make it sound a little bit slower. Who else is on? Jim Horn overdubbed a sax part, and strings, organ and strings from David Foster. So that was a big hit single. I'll show you the single. This was the picture sleeve of it, and it was a fairly sizable hit in the US, number 20, number 38 in the UK. Just while we're on the singles, I'll just show you the other single, which was this guitar, Can't Keep From Crying. This is my US copy, and this is my German copy, with not a very inspiring picture sleeve, I think you'll agree, but just great to see this single on the Apple label, and it's one of the last Beatles solo singles to be released on the Apple label, and this album was one of the last to be released on the Apple label, but George didn't put it out on the Apple label because he was a bit fed up with Apple at the time, and he put it out with this sort of chewed apple core design, which I suppose was a dig at the Beatles' Apple empire falling apart. And it's slightly incongruous, the packaging here, because it's sort of trying to be a bit full of humour, like "Oh, not him again," and this huge smiling picture of George, whereas the actual music and this brightly coloured sleeve, which a lot of people think is a bit cheap. I'm kind of on the fence on this one. I think it can be interpreted as looking a bit cheap, but I think the original cutout sleeve is quite original. So where was I? Yeah, so the packaging, it's kind of trying to inject, I think Karen Tyler said, so George finished the album and said, this is a bit depressing, and told the guys to try and inject some humour into the packaging, so this is what they've done. And it's, take it or leave it, it's okay. So I think George was a bit defensive following the criticism of his tour and his last album, Dark Horse, and he put this out in quite a hurry, because it only came out 9 months after Dark Horse, which is not a long amount of time in the 70s. I mean, in the 60s people were putting out 2 albums a year, but in the 70s that was unusual. So Karen Tyler, true to form, slagged off this album, and I do find it amusing, their humour, even if I don't agree with it. So, and the needle of the listener's personal ecstatograph points sullenly towards zero throughout. I just think that's a wonderful line. George Peckham, I'm not going to show you this on the video, but I'll just point out what I'm talking about. He did the mastering of this album, and thanks to my book, Long and Winding Road by Neville Stannard, good book, thanks for that, he tells you what is written on the inner groove. So the guy who did the mastering is the guy who just made the record in effect, and he sort of scribbled this message to George on the second side of the record. It says, "Ooh, George, you're such a dark horse, love George," which I think is quite amusing. And if you hold it up to the light, you can see, I'm not sure if it's on every pressing, but you can see that. So I thought that was worth mentioning. This is a coaster of Extra Texture, which I ordered online a few years ago, along with the All Things Must Pass cover. What else have I got to tell you about this? I think I'm almost done. I would sum it up by saying it's not much fun to listen to. You have to be in the mood, but it is soulful. I know my friend Dave Costello sort of rediscovered this album fairly recently and is heavily into it. It tends to be a bit overshadowed by what came next, 33 and the Third, George Harrison self-titled, which to me are superior albums, but there's not a huge gap. I mean, there is a gap in my opinion, but it's not as yawning as one might imagine. So the interviews around this time, he did do interviews to promote this record, but you could tell his heart wasn't really in it, and he was saying things like, "I'd rather be an ex-Beatle than an ex-Nazi," and describing songs like Grey Cloudy Lies as a kind of 4 a.m. type song, and Tired of Midnight Blue. He said it's the kind of song when you're out at a clubbing in the early hours of the morning and you wish you were at home, kind of thing. Hence the title, Tired of Midnight Blue. So a challenging period for George. His marriage was breaking up, but he had just met Olivia, so that was on the bright side. And you know, he would do some great music after this. It's just that this was caught him at a challenging time, but it's not without its merits and worth checking out. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.